I would like to welcome you to this new episode of A Few Minutes With. It's a joy to have you here today. About 2 months ago, I was perusing the booksellers' tables at the Festival of Homiletics in Pittsburgh and ran across a book that both the colors and design and the title jumped out at me. It's Wounded Pastors by James Fenimore, and my guest today, the Reverend Carol Howard. Carol is a Presbyterian minister serving as senior pastor at Bedford Presbyterian Church in New York. Anybody that's been around the theological block has seen her books, her commentaries, her blog posts, her guest pieces for everything from the Washington Post and Newsweek to Huffington Post, Christian Century. If you haven't seen her work, you've just not been paying attention. She's very well published and very well known. And in fact, Carol, when I posted that I was going to be having you on as a guest, one person commented and referred to you as a cutting edge Christian theologian. So there you go. That's the buildup for you. So Carol, it's great to have you with me. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this and all of your kind words and taking the time.
I'm delighted to do it. And I tell you, you've mentioned taking time. There is so much that I got out of your book that this could probably be 3 or 4 episodes. I'll resist the temptation into making this a series. But this is such a rich book that you and James wrote. And I have to tell you, it hit me deeply. And I'm sure you all have heard this a lot. But there were so many things about this that resonated with me, particularly from the early years of my ministry when I was still trying to get my footing. How am I supposed to be a rector of a church? And then COVID, which I'll talk about in a little bit, comes in. And so there was so much about this that resonated. So for me, thank you for writing this, because it's something that you feel like you're not alone when you see something. You hear it, but when you see it in writing, then you get the validation that you're not alone in this. I want to begin by asking you, do you think that with COVID coming about and your opportunity to work with James in writing this book and starting to talk to pastors and clergy, did you get the sense that if COVID had not happened, so many of us and our colleagues would have essentially been suffering in silence and not trying to talk about or figure out what was going on in terms of clergy health and self-care?
Yeah, it's interesting. I started this book about 6 years ago because I read a book called Healing Spiritual Wounds. And it was basically geared toward lay people, the people who had gone through having pedophile priests or, some horrible event. I grew up in a very strict conservative fundamentalist background, and so I was sorting through all of that. And so when the book came out, people just kept saying, a lot of my audience is clergy, and they were like, okay, well, yeah, we know this happens, we understand it, but what about us? Are you going to write a book about what we're going through? And so there was this sense of, oh, people are really damaged. They're really having a hard time. And I'm kind of like you, Matt. I had a difficult time at, in the beginning, as you said, getting my legs. So I was kind of writing this book, thinking about other people and thinking about that experience reaching way back to when I started. And then COVID hit. And that's when it got kind of real. I was just starting at this congregation, and anxiety was really high. And my friends were going through the same thing. And then nobody could wait till the the sanctuaries opened, and we figured like when the sanctuary opened, everyone would come pouring in, come back to church. And
Right.
so we opened up the sanctuaries and like nobody came back. They were all still online. Like pajama church is really fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we're just in the same boat with so many sporting events and theaters and music events. It's just people got out of the habit of gathering in those third spaces. And so that became another crisis in a way. So yeah, I would be talking to my friend and colleague Jim, and he was doing a lot of the technical work at our church.
Mm-hmm.
And so and he's also, yeah, he had a counseling center in our church, or a counseling office as part of the Samaritan Counseling Center. And so we were just discussing about, people that I was consulting with or coaching, and people that he was working with. And as I would talk to different presbyteries, I realized, oh, wow, this book is more important than ever. And he began to give me a lot of the framework around the family systems theories.
Mm-hmm.
And, so we began to talk around, Bowen and everything. And so that is how Jim got involved. But yeah, I had a lot of it written before COVID. And then when COVID hit, it became just much more of a like hot topic, right?
Yeah.
And gave us that opportunity to talk more about it, I think.
Well, and I wonder, as you were talking to clergy and interviewing them for background for this book, my experience was I discovered things in my congregation at that point in time, and witnessed in other clergy friends in their congregations. It was below the surface, but COVID was just that moment where it just ripped the Band-Aid completely off in one big swoop, and everything just came pouring out. Is that kind of the sense you got from others, that they sensed something was there, but it wasn't until around COVID that all of the ugliness and difficulty and dysfunction came out?
Yeah, that definitely occurred in many congregations. And, we had several things going on, right? We had this political environment that
Mm-hmm.
was making us more and more polarized. We had social media, which is like literally designed to make us fight.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the place where a lot of us were getting our only social interaction. We had the isolation, the anxiety, the depression that we were going through individually. And so all of these crises were kind of coming together, not only the anxiety around a pandemic, but this sort of engineered anxiety that was occurring on social media, plus the mental health crisis that many of us went through and many of us are still going through.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing, and I heard a clergy friend refer to it as having PTSD coming out of COVID, and it didn't seem realistic at first, because you're thinking, a military veteran or combat veteran having PTSD, but there are a lot of people, to your point, that still have been deeply scarred by this, and just, it's a long road trying to pull themselves or get help being pulled out of.
Right. I read something recently and I can't even remember where I read it, which is sad. Sorry.
But we read a lot.
That's a footnote. But there's something about like we talk in terms of PTSD, but sometimes we just have PTS. It may not be a disorder yet, but
Yeah.
we've definitely gone through this post-traumatic experience. And that's important to sort out, even if we're not a veteran.
Yeah.
That we had 3,000 people dying, and many of our communities were affected more than others. And many of our churches, we were working with older folks. And so it just became a very scary time. And we try to put a happy spin on it, and we try to, be very optimistic about it. But it was painful. It was hard.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things that fell quickly onto my list of things they didn't teach you in seminary. Although I have learned, and I'm sure it's been your experience too, if we were to learn everything in seminary that we needed to, we would all still be in seminary. We'd never get into the pulpit.
20-year program.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. So you and Jim talk with one voice through a lot of the book, but social media that you mentioned a few minutes ago is something that comes up fairly often. And you talk about not only the positives, clergy and smaller, more rural areas using it to stay connected and build collegial relationships and friendships, but you also talk about the ways that you've been hurt by social media and some, I don't know if this is the right word, victimized by what you've experienced on social media. So for new clergy especially, or any clergy that are struggling with how to find that balance of reliance on social media versus avoidance, what would you give to them? And then I guess as a follow-up to that, looking at social media, do the benefits even still outweigh the negatives at this point?
I think that's a conversation not only for clergy, but that's sort of a national conversation we're going through, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're looking at teens and how much anxiety and depression has gone up, especially with teenage girls. And they're looking at how it's affecting teenage mental health. And so this is a big question. I often talk to Aaron Ballard. He's at Unvirtuous Abbey.
Mm-hmm.
And he's great. But we used to always say, like, the number one rule is, if it's not fun, walk away. Like, you got to be having fun. If you're not having fun anymore, it's not worth it. You just got to walk away. And so I think that's a big rule. If it becomes a place where you're fighting all the time or where you're frustrated all the time, just leave it alone, walk away. I think, understanding that it is designed to kind of bring out the worst in us is an important thing to remember, especially when you realize, you'll meet people in person and you're like, wow, this is a very pleasant person and they're horrible online.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. You just know, like, everything horrible has been filtered into your feed.
Right. Right.
And so so that's important to remember. But I don't know, I spent like most of my time on social media on Twitter, and I, unlike a lot of people, loved Twitter because it was very much kind of a news place where you could get a lot of journalism, get a lot of facts, get a lot of, academics and things that I don't experience as much on Facebook and Instagram.
Yeah.
But now, it's become evil, or it was kind of getting into evil territory for a while there. but now it's like I can't go on there anymore. So, it's a tough call. I keep hoping something else will come up to replace things, but I don't know. Don't let my publisher hear this, but I've just been disengaging more and more. Some people are like writers are using Substack, but I can't bear to like put any more email into other people's like, I'm always behind on email. So I don't know. That just feels like trudgery for me. So I don't know. Somebody invent something fabulous.
Well, until the fabulous thing is invented, and maybe that's something you'll do down the road as part of your vocation. But have you, in talking to folks for this book and just colleagues in the Presbyterian Church or even across the ecumenical spectrum, are you finding that people are getting comfortable and finding other things that are out there that kind of give them that balance, whereas they pull back from the connection of social media, they're not feeling disconnected because there are other things that are filling that void?
I still feel like people are pretty disconnected. I mean, we're starting to get our conferences back a little bit. We're starting to get, some of those spaces back, but most of my meetings are on Zoom now, and so, which is great in some ways. And then other ways, it's like, well, we can't go out to lunch after a Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a bummer. So I don't know. What do you think? Do you think they're getting back together? I kind of feel like we're not, or just a little bit, maybe.
I don't. And, I've noticed a little bit less connection for me with colleagues. I think part of it is just the nature of growing and changing ministry, and they're moving into new fields and new calls and that sort of thing. As you were asking that, I was thinking in seminary, we were told at the beginning of our junior year, look around you. This is the group that's going to be your support for the rest of your vocation, the rest of your ministry. And I know that as a fact, those people are there, but the ability to even get in touch with them, whether it's time or busyness or whatever the thing is, it's not there as relevant. So I'm feeling a bit of disconnect there. I do have a core group of people that I will pick up my phone and text. It's weird to say that you pick up your phone to text somebody, you don't pick it up to call somebody. So I have those connections, but there's still that, I wonder what so-and-so's doing. I wish we could catch up and talk, and then you get sidelined. Now, I do also am aware that if you think I should call somebody, I wonder why we haven't talked, pick up the phone and call them. Don't just sit there and wonder why you haven't talked. So I wonder how much of the disconnect people are feeling is of their own creation.
Yeah. Well, then do you ever get in those situations where you're like sending 15 emails to set up a phone call, and you're just thinking, how come I can't just like call this person?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll be, even setting up this conversation with you, I mean, it's very clear. If you want to talk to Carol, here's the phone number, but instead it's like, I don't want to bother her. So she can just answer these 6 emails when she gets a chance as we work this out. So, yeah, I think that is still, yeah. Talking about friendships, both colleague friendships and personal friendships. There are 3 areas of friendship that you and Jim talk about in the book. And it was interesting for me because I'd never even heard of this distinction. And in truth be told, a lot of what's in this book, whether it's family systems or some of the other things you all cover, was new to me. So thank you for opening my eyes to that. But you talk about the 3 types of friendship of utility and pleasure and true friendships. So for those who may be watching or listening that are like me and didn't know there was a spectrum or categories of friendship, could you talk a little bit about what each one of those is? And as part of that, the upside and I guess the danger of focusing on just one of the 3 rather than trying to, I guess, integrate them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is important, I think, as ministers, because we're always in and out of the realm of friendship. In some ways, our congregations are, I like to think of them as communities of friends. And we definitely have this example of Jesus, who was a friend and, had these friends that he traveled together, and he turned to them and said, you're no longer servants, but you're friends. And so there's this deep bond and connection that he clearly has with these people. But utilitarian friendships, those are like the networking events that you go to for work. Those are the people that in order to, in order to get something out of them. Not that it's like totally nefarious or anything. It's just the way the world works, right? Yeah. I got a guy. Yeah. Like I got a friend who can help you out with this. And so that's an important distinction, though, when you think about networking friends and you think about friends for pleasure. So there are friends that you hang out with because you have tons of fun with them.
Yeah.
And you probably can't call them if you're in the hospital and you need a ride home, but you can go out with them and get a drink with them, and they'll make you laugh all night. And so there are friends for pleasure. And then there are those true friends, those people that you can call in the middle of the night when you're in the emergency room, or people that you can call when you have to move, or people that you can call, when you're in these like horrible situations. And those are your true friends. They're people that you show up for, they show up for you, and you're kind of part of each other.
Mhm.
And it's important to be able to know those distinctions, understand them. And even if you don't agree with them, it kind of gives you a framework to sort of wrestle with.
And there was one important point that I loved about the true friendship discussion that you all have, and it's that true friends will speak a truth sometimes that you may not want to hear, but that you need to hear. And it's done in a much more loving and supportive way where, as I was reading, I was thinking about situations where somebody in a congregation may say the exact same thing, but they're overstepping a line because they're evaluating your relationship, your friendship in a way that's completely different from the reality of the relationship. So I was interested to see you draw that distinction about true friends speaking a truth that you need to hear, even if you don't want it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, hopefully you have the people, with the bullshit detectors. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Okay. You did have Nadia on the show, didn't you?
Yes. And there was no buzzer there, so there's no buzzer here.
So if anybody in my congregation's listening, I'm sorry. But you do have to have those friends who are able to call you out on things, or even just to be able to point things out to you that you're living in denial about. So that's really, really important.
Have you seen or encountered, as you've talked to folks for this book or just in conversations in general, have you seen where they have themselves run into a negative thing where rather than focusing on, I look at this person and recognize, okay, this is just a congregational friend. This is somebody, you can go to dinner with and that sort of thing, but not dive deeply into the deeper things that you would with a true friendship. Clergy that have fallen the pratfalls of aiming for one type of friendship and setting that boundary and missing completely and discovering that they've inadvertently set something else up that's far more unhealthy.
Oh yeah, I mean, that I think happens all the time. And there's also Marissa Franco, I believe was her name. She writes a really wonderful book called Platonic, and it also describes sort of attachment theory, and she's bringing that to friendship. And sometimes, you can be anxious about a friend. You can worry about whether they're texting you back or not, or you can also be too detached, or I don't know. It's really interesting. But being able to understand your friendships and what it's like for both of you. Sometimes we might overshare with a friend who's not ready for that.
Yeah.
or we might be too vulnerable with somebody, and just understanding that oftentimes friendship takes on a bit of mutuality. And I think that can be really hard for clergy because we are so used to giving so much of ourselves and not necessarily receiving much back. So I talk to clergy a lot who would have these lopsided friendships where, they would be super comfortable doing anything for anybody who asked them. But if they needed something, then they were not comfortable with that at all. They were really concerned about doing that. They just didn't want to do that at all. And so or, the sense of oversharing, or not, having a friend who overshares and you don't ever say anything back. There are ways in which we are vocationally in these lopsided relationships. And so we can tend to bring those into our personal relationships outside of work as well.
Yeah. Do you think in times of transition where a new priest is coming in, do you feel it's the responsibility of the incoming clergy person to set with the congregation the expectations of these are the parameters of our relationship? Do you think it's the responsibility of, in the Episcopal Church, we have transition ministers that come in and work with congregations to prepare them for the next priest coming in? Do you think it's the responsibility of that sort of person, or should we just throw caution to the wind and pray mightily that the congregation will just figure it out for themselves, which, sometimes is not the case?
Yeah, I think the transitional pastor, that would be ideal, right? Because they're both saying, okay, the person who was here before, you're going to have a different relationship with them now. You can't be calling them all the time.
Yeah.
And, they may be able to help the new person coming on by saying, you really don't want to spend your family vacations with the new priest. It's
Yes.
just
Yeah.
not appropriate. Just don't ask. So ideally that would be a great place for that to happen. It is difficult. I have followed a couple of pastors who didn't have a lot of boundaries with their congregation, and so they would want to spend vacations, and they would get really upset that I didn't want to hang out with them all vacation. Not that it's just a good boundary to not be working during your vacation.
Yes. Yes.
But it's hard to understand when people have had a priest who has done that in the past. So transitional pastor would be great if they're able to do that. But we're always trying to set up boundaries in certain ways, and we don't want them to be too firm. We don't want to cut people off, but we want to make sure that we maintain those boundaries so that we can have a distinct sense of self in the midst of it.
Do you think it's harder to distinguish boundaries for a clergy person when you draw the distinction in between introvert and extrovert? Because speaking for myself, I'm an introvert. So for instance, on a Sunday morning, I do my 2 services. I do the adult forum, I do the coffee hour. By the time the coffee hour has ended, I can feel that my energy is pretty much tapped for the day. And it's a foreign concept for me, for somebody that could do the same thing and then want to find another group of people to be with, or another crowd of people to be with. Do you think that introvert extrovert distinction makes creation of boundaries more difficult depending on where you fall on that spectrum?
Yeah, I think so. And it's important for us to be really, really mindful of what's happening within our bodies and what's happening with our energy. A couple of weeks ago in the lectionary, it was talking about Jesus resting. And so I was looking at some of the research on rest, and there's like 7 different forms of rest. And one of those forms of rest is social rest.
Mm-hmm.
So they were talking about being very aware of the people who both suck your energy and the people who give you energy. And also, I think that introvert extrovert sort of reality is also very, very important in that sense. And, it's going to be important sometimes. If you're an introvert, you may need the boundary of, gosh, I really need this time to myself. I need to re-energize on Sunday afternoon. please don't call me, please don't text me, I just have to have that time. And then, like you say, some people are just getting started. They want to go out for run. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's really important to understand when to rest, and that social rest is all a part of that.
I am very blessed, and this sounds like bragging. So for any clergy who are listening to this, I'm sorry, I'm not bragging intentionally, but I have been very blessed at the parish where I currently serve by a vestry and a congregation that are adamant that I take my time. At a vestry meeting in January, they said, "How many weeks of vacation do you get each year?" And I told them, and they said, "And how many did you use?" And I got kind of quiet, and I said, "Well, I came close." They're like, "No, it's in there for a reason. You need to take your continuing ed time. You need to take your vacation time." So
Beautiful.
I know it's a gift that I've been given by this group of people that don't want me to burn out and want me to take care of myself. I know that's not the situation for many, many other clergy, regardless of denomination or faith background. And so, I try to be mindful of the gift I've been given, knowing that's not a gift available to a lot of folks.
Yeah, that's excellent. And so important, I think, for clergy to have that, to not have to feel anxious or guilty about giving, getting their time off and going someplace.
Yeah. Yeah. On the subject of boundaries, one thing that I really enjoyed about this book, there was a section where you all wrote about the warning signs. I think it was 12 total. These are the signs where the boundaries are not working. And you talk about feeling exhaustion or being resentful or bitter. You talk about increased anxiety, a desire to avoid people. And as I was reading through that list, it was interesting that I could identify points in my ministry where one would jump out and say, "Oh, I felt that. Oh, I felt that." But it wasn't until I saw this list that I realized that I was not just feeling these one at a time. They were overlapping, and I was actually fighting against a riptide in some case, again, primarily during COVID, fighting against this riptide of thinking I was doing great to stay close to shore, and I was just getting pulled further and further away. Um, what advice or counsel would you give to a clergy person? Use the phrase determining what's needed
Mm.
after looking at that list. Uh, what advice would you give to a clergy person who hasn't done or actually did the same thing I did? They weren't able to look at the totality of everything in the moment, but they were just seizing on one thing, and then they discover, I'm under a lot. How do I get out of all this? And then they try and do the sudden thing by just making a complete 180, which never works, because then you're just trying to shed it all at one time, and it's not possible. What would you say, or what have you heard or had conversations about in that regard of just trying to dig out?
Yeah, that's so easy to do. And sometimes we don't even know it's happening until we're completely and utterly burnt out. And we're like,
Yeah.
why can't I get out of bed? What's going on? And then you figure it out. But it can be, like you said, like the riptide just pulling you out, and you don't even realize it until you look at the shore, and it's completely different from where you came in. So I think, like you're saying, if you are able to identify that, and you just have to be really careful to listen to your body, listen to your cues, listen to the anger or the frustration. For me in particular, I'm really good at denial. So I'm always putting a happy spin on things. I'm one of those really annoying pastors.
No.
So I'm always like, putting this happy spin on things, and then and then it's like too late when I realize, like, oh no, this is I'm burnt out. So but yeah, so if you can journal, look back on your journals. If you're not able to journal a lot, just write down as much as you can, like, where is this, where is this coming from? Try to list things, try to, if any way that you can kind of get it from your internal body out there. So I journal because I am also an introvert, but there are people who like to talk things out. If you're able to have a therapist or a counselor or somebody that or a good friend where you're able to talk it out. But if you can get that list and then just sort of chip away at it one at a time, because oftentimes when you set up boundaries, people don't respond well to them.
Right.
And so it's important that you realize, you can't tackle them all at one time. So if you're, working on one, and then you get that response and you kind of work through it and then try to work on the next one. But yeah, it's impossible to do them all at one time. Or sometimes you'll find, something's happening with your spouse that's also happening at church, that's also happening with the parent you're taking care of, and you want to like take care of them all at one time, and that's really difficult too. So there's a lot of interplay oftentimes within our homes and within our churches and how we function and the roles that we take up.
If this is too personal a question, just smile and tell me to move on. But talking about your leaning towards denial, over the course of your ministry, how have you been able to, I mean, you certainly recognize it because you're able to name it. How have you seen in your own ministry, in your own life, a shift from denial being such a huge part of it to wherever you are on your journey now? What's that been like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard just because, and lately I've been like wrestling with the idea of kind of optimism and so how do you, like, I'm generally an optimistic person. If you're an Enneagram person, I'm a 7. And so, so I'm always looking at the bright, shiny part of the picture. But also, so that keeps me a lot of times from looking at the difficulties of how things are. And I know sometimes, I had my choir director come in the other day, and he was like, wow, the attendance is really low. I'm in New England, and everybody goes on vacation. It's summertime, so it gets really low in the summer, and like my immediate reaction was, I thought, you can't say that. You can't say that. we gotta make sure we only say, put the positive energy out there. You can only say positive things. So that's what I'm thinking on the inside. And then I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. It's low. Yeah, it just is. Yeah.
But there is merit to your internal response, though, because it's part of, in my experience, educating a congregation to don't focus all your energy mourning what's not there or what's not taking place. Celebrate who is there. You may have 10 today, you may have 50 next week. The 10 are just as important and valuable and loved as the additional 40. So I think the inner dialogue you were having with yourself was actually something, maybe in my opinion, was better being said. Yeah, acknowledging it's low, but also, this is the joy of them being here.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. That's what I always say. It's not about who's not here. It's about who's here. Who showed up.
That's right. Now, if you don't show up or he doesn't show up, then it's something. There was another really powerful chapter, and again, it was concepts of forgiveness that I didn't know about. I mean, for me, forgiveness is just a single term that you wrestle with, but you talk about forensic and therapeutic. And again, for those who may be watching or listening, they may be like, for me, new terms. So how would you, what's your elevator speech explanation of those two types of things, and how can they work are they best left standing alone, or can you integrate them with the third one, which is the theological forgiveness?
Yeah, I mean, I work a lot with clergy sexual misconduct, clergy abuse, and this comes up, the idea of forgiveness comes up a lot, and sometimes it comes up in very difficult ways. Kaya Oakes just wrote a really fascinating and good book on forgiveness that, I would recommend to all of you. But so forgiveness can absolutely be used as a spiritual, almost spiritual abuse. A victim will come in, and the pastor who just doesn't want to deal with it, or the denomination who doesn't want to deal with it, will say, well, don't you need to forgive that person? Make sure you forgive them. And it's a way of saying, don't call the cops, just sweep it under the rug. We don't want to deal with it,
Right.
And that has happened over and over and over again. And Kaya talks about kind of the apology tours that politicians go on,
Yeah.
and when they've been caught doing something horrible, and then
Right.
they're saying sorry, but it's a little shady. Yeah, they're just trying to get out of trouble. So, but forgiveness is an extremely important thing for us to kind of get our heads around. And just like there are different types of friendship, there are different types of forgiveness. And there is forensic forgiveness. So that is like taking somebody to court. That's the legal part of forgiveness. And, oftentimes you may forgive somebody and give them grace and give them, you've gone through the really, really hard work of forgiving them, but they still need to be in prison,
Yeah.
They need to be rotting in jail. So, and I feel like this a lot of times, like with pedophiles who have used the church to victimize people.
Right. Yeah.
And so sometimes we may not go through with that forensic forgiveness. Sometimes, you might see like a pastor who takes their church to court over $2,000, and they're spending $13,000 on lawyer fees in order to get this that doesn't make sense. So let go of forensic forgiveness. Just let it go. So just knowing, okay, there may be forensic forgiveness, and then therapeutic forgiveness is understanding that when you forgive somebody, it can lead you into a healthier place. So we're talking a lot in the book about differentiation, and that's oftentimes why we have these boundaries, and we don't want to be enmeshed with the anxiety of the congregation, or the anxiety and the disruption of the system that we're in. And oftentimes forgiveness allows us to have that differentiation, because many times if we are ruminating and we are not allowing ourselves to forgive somebody, we're bound to them, and we're bound to that thing that has been that wrong, that has instead of like letting it go. And so many times we are not forgiving to let them off the hook, but we're forgiving for ourselves, because we know it's important for us as humans, as we grow. and then there's theological forgiveness. And for some people, theological forgiveness means that it's all encompassing, that, it includes forensic forgiveness, and it includes that therapeutic forgiveness. And it's just that like overwhelming forgiveness that's all inclusive. I don't agree with that. I don't think God wants us to, let a predator, a sexual predator who victimizes children off the hook.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I think God's a God of justice. And oftentimes if somebody is being victimized, we need to make sure that we go through the forensic forgiveness. So, it's very, very different for each situation. It's very, very, but I will say with theological forgiveness, I think what's important is understanding the incredible grace of God and how we can have that grace towards one another, and how we can, accept the mercy of God and also extend that to other people. And so being able to see our story in the midst of that generous, beautiful, gracious God that we have, I think is incredibly important. So, as we talk about forgiveness, we always need to realize there are different sorts of forgiveness. I'll recommend another book. Desmond Tutu and Mafo Tutu wrote a book called The Book of Forgiving.
Yes.
Good. Have you read it? It's so good.
I've read most of it. In fact, when long before I was in seminary, my family and I were members of a church just outside Washington, and she was one of the clergy residents. And so we had an opportunity to get to know her before she moved back overseas. But when that book came out, it was just everybody in the church couldn't get it fast enough to read it. It's a remarkable, anybody in that family, they could sit down and write a recipe and it would be riveting. It's just the experiences they bring, and the passion and the insights just from what they've been exposed to in their lives. One thing.
So wise.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And one thing about forgiveness, and I think one reason why this chapter resonated so much with me, in spring, before we broke our education time off for summer vacation, I had a group of people that we explored the topic of forgiveness, but we did it through the book Amish Grace, which was based on the schoolhouse shooting at Nickel Mine School. And the swiftness with which the Amish community forgave and forgave and forgave, and then went to the funeral of the shooter and supported the shooter's family. And it was a difficult conversation for some because of the speed with which they forgave, wrestling with, were they selling themselves short over things that they needed to wrestle with within their community before forgiving. It was a challenging thing. So I think reading this chapter of your book, almost immediately after having had that conversation, the word grace that you brought up, it very much is what you saw in the Amish community in Nickel Mines.
Yeah, it's something to struggle with for sure. Part of my story is I grew up with a pastor who was a pedophile and preyed upon somebody in my family, and my mom and dad made the very, very faithful choice to not for them, it was a faithful choice to not prosecute him, not bring him up on charges. And I always worry that he went to another congregation and did the same thing. Yeah. And he's very much, asked to the church leadership, asked him to forgive. So I kind of carry that around,
Yeah.
I don't think my faith would lead me in the same direction.
I don't think you're alone. I think, I try to not get overly angry about things, but I can confidently say that would be a situation where if somebody in my family or a friend of mine had encountered that, the collar may have had to come off, because I don't think I would have reacted in a very pastoral way represented by the collar. So I would have had to do it in a way with, hiding the collar and hiding my identity.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you to put on your seminary dean hat, your seminary president hat.
All right.
All of these things, from my experience and people I've encountered in my ministry, all of these things that have taken place, we found out about them as they were happening. It's almost like, okay, surprise, you're not ready for this. Here it is. What can seminaries be doing apart from teaching family systems, which my seminary did offer a family systems course, but I was having such anxiety trying to wrap my head around it that I didn't take the family systems course. But what can seminaries be doing apart from family systems to prepare a future clergy for when they have these situations arise, or these encounters, or difficult, painful relationships with congregation, any of these things?
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to my former podcast co-host Derek Weston, and we were talking about this. I asked him to read the book and read it just to get his reflections on it. And he said, every seminary student should read this, but then they probably wouldn't go to the ministry. So, it's a catch-22. But there have been DMin students reading it, so that's good.
Yeah.
There have been some seminary students who've been reading it. But yeah, that's a good question. I mean, oftentimes what makes a great seminary professor isn't the same thing that makes a great pastor. And so I think oftentimes, we have these wonderful, wonderful professors who don't really know what's going on in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not putting, like, you can't be good at everything, right?
Right.
You
Right.
can't. But maybe if we had more practical theology along with our academics, which some seminaries are better than others, but certainly, I think that when you do have a practical theologian, they are often able to kind of identify what we should be reading inside and outside of theological landscapes. Because I feel like so much of what has been helpful for me in navigating the church is when I find a really, really good thinker who's able to take some sort of scientific research or psychology or whatever, and then put it on the church.
Mm-hmm.
Or read our situations in church through that lens. And so, if we can do some more interdisciplinary study and also have more practical theology, practical reflection, and something other than, I feel like we have all these internships and CPEs and things that, like, it's already incredibly expensive, and we're not making enough money at the end of it to pay back our student loans. So, some way to get that into the classroom instead of as another internship, or, or something else that makes this even more cost prohibitive.
Yeah, and I think even with the internships, I had an incredible field ed supervisor for the 2 years. I knew that I had a call for rural ministry, small parish ministry. So that's where I did my 2 years. And she was very open. She wanted me to experience the good and the bad of small parish ministry. Others that I was in seminary with never got to preach, never got invited to meetings, didn't get to see it. So they were, what was the name of that movie? Eyes Wide Shut, I think, when they left seminary and went into their first call. So a lot of the seminary internships, I think you have to have somebody that's willing to be open enough with the intern to show them, this is what you're feeling a call for. I wouldn't be a good supervisor or mentor for this if I didn't let you see it. And I just wish that everybody had that experience.
Yeah, I feel like the calls that or the internships that everybody wanted to be at were, at these prestigious churches where you weren't really allowed to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the people who were able to go to internships where, they were preaching once a month or whatever, those were the ones that were really good. So.
Yeah. Now, taking off your seminary dean hat and putting on your congregational dean hat, not pastor, but just somebody, what should congregations be exposed to? We talked earlier about that could be a valuable part of what a transition minister does in that interim period between clergy. But what else can congregations be encouraged to do or led to do, assuming they even have the interest in doing it? I mean, some it may just be something else that they just don't have the time or energy or interest in. But what can congregations be doing to prepare themselves? Certainly reading this book would be a huge help because they're going to see it from the other side. But what can congregations do?
Well, I think Jim's writing a book geared toward congregations, which I'm excited about. And so watch for that.
Okay.
So I'm not sure, what it's called or when it's coming out, but I know it is kind of geared toward congregations. I think right now, Friedman wrote, Edwin Friedman, who really took Murray Bowen's family systems theory, and looked at congregations through that lens. He did an excellent job in failure of nerve, I think. Kind of instructing congregations on what to do. There, again, were some frustrating parts about that. He talks about colonialism in like this really aggravating way, and that's a little bit of why I wanted to write my own book. Not that I can do better than the good rabbi, but that was always so frustrating to me. So, but there is this sense of he talks a lot about like when there is unhealth in a body, there are antibodies that show up to fight off that disease. And oftentimes in our congregations, we get real funky around these diseases. We become like the family with the drunk uncle who's just trying to apologize and hide it, and tell stories to excuse him, and doing all these things to work around, and nobody is throwing the drunk uncle out of the Christmas party and saying, we have to drive you home now.
Yep.
And so our churches become these weird dysfunctional places where we know there's bad behavior, and we know there's this bully over here, and we know there's this codependent person over here, and we know there's this narcissist over here, and we know that there's real damage being done, but no one's there to throw them out of the party. Right. And I was looking at some of the statistics around how long managers stay in businesses, and how long pastors stay in churches. And managers and businesses stay a lot longer. So I was asking one of the focus groups, I was saying, well, why is that? Why do you think it is? And they said, well, because in these businesses, you've got like an HR department, you've got guardrails, you have, if there's a customer being nasty, they throw out the customer. They make sure that, the employees aren't being abused. They won't, tolerate the behavior.
Mhm.
And yet in churches, for some reason, even though our standards should be higher in a lot of ways, many times we're just kind of cleaning up after the drunk uncle, making excuses for them and making
Yeah.
sure that we, hide the liquor and keep all those dysfunctional things that create these systems of unhealth moving into the future.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there is so much. I'm sitting here knowing that I could continue this conversation for another 3 hours, just because if you could see the book, it's just highlighted beyond recognition. So there's a lot of wealth in here, and I really do recommend this for clergy and for congregations to read it for a perspective. But apart from this book and the other writing you're doing that may be coming out soon, hopefully, how can folks, if they want to follow along on your journey and see what you're writing about and preaching about and that sort of thing, how can they do that?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm like right in the middle of transitioning. I don't have my website's not up. I'm even like looking at taking my Facebook page down for a minute. So I don't know.
All right. Stay
Not on
tuned.
Twitter anymore. I'm just, yeah, I guess just keep looking. I don't know. I'll show up somewhere.
Yeah, just Google Reverend Carol Howard. Something will pop up somewhere.
There you go.
Well, again, thank you so much for your time. This is an incredibly rich book. I'm grateful for you and Jim writing it, and especially grateful for your time today. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your thoughtful questions and your wonderful interviewing.
Thank you. God bless.